Hi. I had you read a chapter this week, for today, in fact, on um, academic reading. It's called Chapter 2. I shouldn't say I've had you read it for today. At this point, we're not really doing assignments on specific days, but we're just sort of generally doing weeks, right? So this week, I asked you to read this Chapter 2 about reading. They call it academic reading, which is surprising in a book about academic writing. Um, why are they talking about academic reading? Well, as they point out, reading is something you do a lot of in college classes, and um, I was never given this talk, and maybe I could have benefited from it. But I think that when you're assigned something to read, you think, well, here it is. This is the first page. I'll read it, read it, read it, read it, read it. Turn the page, read it through, and say, man, I only sort of get it. Um, but more effective students learn that they need to figure out what in the chapters, what in the book they need to focus on. They'll skim a lot of it and then really focus intensely on the parts that are going to matter, right? Um, I've tried to do that a little bit with your quizzes, your reading quizzes, by giving you questions that mostly have to do with the main topics that are announced in the chapter headings, like effective, effective reading habits, right? The headings like that. But this chapter goes into explicit detail about reading, right? And they make the point that studying something, well, maybe this is my point. Studying something isn't just looking at it, right? If you read a chapter that's not really studying it, studying something means to sit there and kind of examine it, right? Like I'm looking at my watch, but I didn't study it. Now I'm kind of studying it. Yeah. So studying a chapter is similar. You don't just look at it, but you somehow process it more deeply, and they have several suggestions for how to do that. Right? They tell you read something again and again and again, what they call a close reading. That doesn't just mean run your eyes over it again and again, but again, you want to find passages in the reading that you think are the most significant ones and find some way of engaging with it that helps it to stick. And not surprisingly, um, writing helps you to process your reading. Right? So the book has several ways that they suggest that you can kind of interact with the text, um, and help to kind of digest it more and make it stick a little bit better. The first one they mention is annotation. That's making notes in the margins and highlighting and underlining. Highlighting is only mildly effective because you're not really producing any ideas. You're just marking somebody else's ideas as being important. If you can do some writing, if you can put some ideas in your own words, um, that really helps you to grasp concepts. So putting notes in the margins, as they illustrate on page 37, is very helpful. They suggest keeping a reading journal, a double entry journal, where you have two columns in the journal. Each page has two columns, or maybe one page and the other would be your two columns. And you write down, first of all, what is it that this section of the reading says? And then over here, you write down your ideas about it, what you think about it, right? So you're doing really two things. You're summarizing and commenting on. That's a good way to get yourself to process something. They suggest rhetorical analysis. We won't go into that, but that's also very helpful. We're not going to go into it now because we're going to go into it in a few minutes. At the end of the chapter, they have reverse outline, which we've talked about a little bit, making an outline of something. Normally, we make an outline as we're as we're writing a paper, we put together an outline so that we have a roadmap or a blueprint for the paper we're going to make. But you can do what they call a reverse outline, and that's done when you take somebody else's text and draw an outline out of it. You identify what their thesis is and what their main supporting points are. And I asked you to do that in that assignment that I posted late last night. It's open now for you to work on, by the way. So yeah, you can make an outline of something, and that helps you to see not only what the main ideas are, but what the structure of the argument is. And again, you've then processed it pretty well. And then there are three different ways that kind of belong together: summary, paraphrase, and quotation. They talk about summarizing an argument or paraphrasing it are good ways to digest it. You know what a paraphrase is? It's putting things into your own words. And again, having ideas come in to your mind through your eyes or your ears is one way to learn things. But when you produce the ideas yourself, when they flow out of your mouth or out of your pen, there's something about you putting together the ideas and expressing it that helps it to latch on more solidly. So paraphrasing is a good practice, and then summarizing, I put those two together. A summary really is a kind of a paraphrase, but it's a paraphrase of the main ideas of a longer piece of work, a paragraph, a chapter, an article, a book. A summary just pulls out the main ideas. You're going to do a summary as the opening paragraph in your critical summary paper. And then finally, of course, quotations. Quotations are, when you use quotations in your essay, that in itself helps you to process the information. I used to use this other book that I thought was helpful in this topic. So I'm going to talk to you about it. This book talked about reading college books, quote unquote, rhetorically, reading rhetorically. We've been talking about rhetoric as the art of expressing ideas effectively. And to read rhetorically means to use that same part of your mind that you use to create an effective message. Use that to analyze and understand someone else's piece of writing. You kind of see, what was it they did, what they call rhetorical analysis. What kind of audience were they aiming at? What genre did they choose? What assumptions are they making, and so forth. All right, so this book talks about when you read, you should read in drafts the same way that you would write in drafts. When you're reading something important, you go through it quickly, and that's your rough draft. You go through it again a little more slowly and wrestling with it, and finally, you go through it a little more quickly again, just to kind of remind yourself how it all fits together and work out those last little, uncertainties that you have. It's good advice. Of course, just like we said in a couple of videos ago when we were talking about summarizing, first you have to make sure you understand what's being said in the reading that you're doing. So you have to make sure that you're looking up unfamiliar vocabulary. All right. Here is something interesting that they say. They talk about why college reading is so hard. This little blue whiteboard, I keep talking about how stupid it is, but it seems to be just long enough for me to write everything I need. Why is Oh, why is college so hard? Forget that. Forgot the word here. Why is college, why college reading is so hard. There we go. I spoke too soon. Why is college reading so hard? Well, they said there are 4 different reasons. And I'll list them out for you. They say um, unfamiliar vocabulary. That one is probably obvious to you, right? What are these words? Well, you're in college, you're entering into a different level. See, it's just long enough, just like I said. You're entering a different level of, sophistication, and so of course there's going to be a broader vocabulary and a more challenging vocabulary. Um, you know, the writers are using um, difficult language because that difficult language, if they're good writers, that difficult language is the word or the phrase that most accurately expresses what they're trying to say. But if you don't know that word, you got to look it up, and this is can make you feel dumb to see all this unfamiliar vocabulary. But everybody goes through that, and this is how you pick it up. Number 2, unfamiliar rhetorical context. What does that mean? Well, rhetorical context, by that we mean, you see that, unfamiliar rhetorical context. By that we mean, who is speaking and who are they speaking to and for what purpose, right? What was the context? What was the situation? Why did somebody bother writing this? And who is supposed to read it and for what purpose? If you don't know that information, there's lots of written texts that are just really puzzling. You think, who are these people, right? Number 3, unfamiliar genre, a word we've talked about before. Genre, category, type of writing. Right? There are all kinds of types of written texts, and when you come across one that you haven't been, you haven't seen before, you're not familiar with, it could be a struggle to figure out how does that genre work. Um, when you get used to a genre, they're easy to process. We talked a few times about recipes. You know exactly how they'll go. They'll have the title of the dish at the top, have a list of ingredients starting with quantity, and then underneath they'll have instructions and probably describe how many servings or something like that, right? All genres have some kind of formula, and if you're familiar with the formula, then they're easier to process, right? You have these expectations, and then the genre fulfills those expectations, and it feels very comfortable for you. If it's an unfamiliar genre, you're puzzled until you learn about that genre. Finally, lack of background knowledge. You could argue that unfamiliar vocabulary is a kind of lack of background knowledge, but in this case, we're talking about sort of, facts and information that the article is kind of assuming that you know. It's referring to things that maybe you're unfamiliar with. So these are 4 different things that you might want to jot this down. We are going to look at the reading that you're going to do your paper on, and we're going to address each of these in relation to the reading. Okay, so I have posted that article that you're going to write your critical summary on. It's by someone named Andrew Solomon. And the book or the article is called The Closing of the American Book. Yet again, I have just enough space. Look at that. Andrew Solomon, The Closing of the American Book. That's the article. Oops, except you got to have closed quotes. We ran out of room. There we go. This is the article that you're going to write your critical summary on, and I have posted it on Moodle for you. And we're going to, I'm not just going to throw you into analyzing this. We're going to analyze it and discuss it ourselves over the course of a couple of videos here, so you'll be well prepared to do your critical summary. Maybe a helpful way to think about the Andrew Solomon essay, this critical summary project, is that you're going to be, it's almost like you're going to be grading his essay. It doesn't mean you're going to be grading, what we call the mechanical problems with the essay, which would mean like spelling and grammar and word choice and things like that. Presumably, a professional writer like him, and this article is published in the New York Times, supposedly it's polished enough in its style, but we're going to grade it or critique it for, let me write it down. Your critique is going to be of the content, in other words, the ideas, what it is that he says, and how he conveys it, right? In other words, the word that we've been using is his rhetoric. There's what he wants to say, and then there's how he says it. And both of those are something that you can evaluate. And let me just say this: if I gave you something to do a critical summary on, and it was really well argued and very polished, something everyone would agree with, it would be hard to do a critique of it. It's easier to do a critique of something that has problems, right? It's easier to talk about, oh, look, they did this wrong and they did that wrong, than it is to say, oh, look, they did this right and that right. It's possible to talk a bit about, how somebody's rhetoric is effective. And we did that, for example, with the short stories and poems we were looking at. Say, well, look how clever this tactic is, and so forth. But it's kind of easier to write about something that has real flaws. And so I've given you something that has strengths, but it also has some big fat flaws that'll be easy for you to dig into and comment on. Okay, let's see. Yeah. So let me pull out our document, and you can pull out your copy of it. And we will wave these around while we're discussing. Come here. Where did it go? stuck to something else. That's where it is. So here it is. Right? This is the first of a 4-page document that I've given you. The first 2 pages, page front and back, are one document called Literary Reading and Dramatic Decline according to National Endowment for the Arts Survey. The second article, pages 3 and 4, the second sheet of paper, is the essay that you're going to be writing your critical summary about, The Closing of the American Book by Andrew Solomon from the New York Times. Right? What is this first document? Well, this first document is background. You need this to be able to understand this. Right? So from the get-go, we're beginning to learn about the the unfamiliar rhetorical context here. To maybe even before that, we should talk about unfamiliar genre. This article that you're going to write about, The Closing of the American Book, is an article that appeared in the newspaper, but it's not a news story. It's not news. It was in the newspaper, but it's not news. In a newspaper, you'll have news articles, and news, of course, is the stories about factual current events. And then the second most common, or maybe the most common thing in a modern newspaper is advertisements. But then there's a third thing that not really news, but it's commentary on the news. The typical newspaper, this is pretty standard. The typical newspaper has what they call the editorial page. The editorial page. The editor of a newspaper is sort of the person or the people, the group of people, are editors who are in charge of making all the decisions about how the newspaper is going to go day to day. And one of their jobs is to write what they call editorials. They're essays that comment on some aspect of the news. And in the typical American newspaper, each day, maybe except for, each day, roughly, maybe not Saturday, there'll be an essay commenting on some aspect of the news. So the editor or editors will make a decision, gee, this seems like the most important story of the day to comment on. We have strong opinions about this. So they'll write up an essay and publish it on the editorial page. And they call those editorials. There's also, on the editorial page, what they call letters to the editor. Right? So readers write in their comments about either the editorials or the news stories. And I guess most important for what we're talking about, there are what they call op-eds, right? It's an essay that is, some people say it means opinions and editorials. I've been told it means opposite of the editorial page. Let me explain. In the typical American newspaper, at school I have several examples I could have shown you, but because I'm at home, I just had to scrounge and find something. Here's a newspaper from my hometown, the Akron Beacon Journal, Akron, Ohio. This is the front page of the paper. Typically, the typical American newspaper, you can turn the front section around, and those second to last 2 pages, usually this page and this page, are the editorial page. You'll have editorials here, and then op-ed articles, commentary articles here. Right? Because this is the Thanksgiving edition, the editors didn't have editorials, but they still do have. They still have this. See, it says at the top there, doesn't it? Commentary, right? They're letting you know this is not news. This is somebody's opinion, right? And there's something below it too. There's usually several essays like that. So they call that the op-ed page, opposite of the editorial. Here's our own mirror news from our campus, and I happen to have a copy of one of those. And same thing. If you take the newspaper, open it up to that second last page. Look at that. It says opinion, right? Opinion, right there. And we have some of our student writers writing about Gen Z. And over here we have one of our student writers. Is it? Yes, another article by another kind of op-ed by another one of our student writers. So that's the genre that we're talking about. Where to go? What with my essay? Ah, there it is. Okay. This essay by Andrew Solomon is something that was published in the New York Times. He doesn't write for the New York Times. He's a writer he's just a writer, but he submitted this essay that he wrote to the New York Times commenting on a news story that he read in the Times, right? And they published it, right? He's a famous, kind of important writer, and so that got their attention, and they published it. The background article that I said I'm including as well, this first couple of pages, this is what they call a press release. Right? A press release, you've heard that word a bunch of times. You hear it on the news all the time, but you very well may not know what it is. Right? I know from talking to students before that they don't really know. They think it's something that the press releases, but it's not something that the press releases. It's something that is released to the press. Right? The press meaning the news media. Originally the press was the printing press, the big machine that would print the newspaper. But now by the press we mean any of the news media. It could be television, radio, print. A press release, when somebody or some organization has something important that they think the news media should know, or maybe something that the news media is going to find out about and they want to have their say on it, they issue a press release. If the governor decides she's going to keep businesses shut down for another 2 weeks, well, her office is probably going to send out a press release announcing, she's going to make a speech today, and the speech is going to talk about such and such. If some celebrity gets caught doing something like, dishonest, like helping their child cheat to get into a prestigious college, or somebody, famous is having an affair, or the Tigers hire a new shortstop, or somebody's going to publish a new book, or anything that's news, they or somebody for them will write up this document and release it to the press. And they do that partly to announce something, partly to get some publicity, but also to spin it the way they want. You know what I mean by spinning it? By giving their version of it, right? Again, I mentioned, like, if celebrities have a scandal or something, they want to release a press release about their own scandal, not because they're proud of it, but because they want to they want to flood the world with their version of it, and they want to put the best face on it that they can. In this case, this is a press release. If we look at the back of page 2, it says this article is a press release from the National Endowment of the Arts website. National Endowment for the Arts, the NEA. Well, unfamiliar genre, it's a press release, right? Now you're learning what a press release is, and you're learning what an op-ed article is. These are unfamiliar genres. There will be unfamiliar vocabulary when you get into this. The unfamiliar rhetorical context that we are talking about, right? Unfamiliar rhetorical context. The National Endowment for the Arts published a survey. First of all, they did a survey. They had a survey done to find out how much literature, not how much, but whether people were reading literature or not in America. And then they're publishing the results of that survey. Right? Publishing the results of that survey. Whoops, there it is. And 2 days later, this survey came out on July 8th, 2004. Right? And this says July 10th, 2004. So 2 days later, the New York Times was publishing some commentary on that news article. So the National Endowment for the Arts, it's a federal government agency. It's part of the government. An endowment means big pot of money that's supposed to be spent towards some purpose, right? So the National Endowment for the Arts, the federal government gives them a big fat chunk of money to promote the arts. And what do we mean by the arts? You think of art, you think of an art museum, you think of paintings and statues. That's art, but so is music and literature and drama and lots of other things, right? So because they're supposed to be promoting the arts, they want to find out how much literature people are reading. Right? This is a word you know a little bit because we've talked about it. We did a paper on some literature, the poems and short stories that we read and wrote about. So this survey is about how many Americans are reading literature, what they are calling literary reading. Right? Literary reading, literature. And if you look on page 2 of this document, the last full paragraph of the document, it says that this is the results of a survey done by the Census Bureau in 2002. Why is it being published in 2004? It's a big survey. They surveyed 17,000 adults in America. So it takes a while to process all that and write it up. They asked whether those 17,000 adults, whether during the previous 12 months they had read any, quote, novels, short stories, poetry, or plays in their leisure time that were not required for work or school. Right? So that's what they're measuring here. Literary reading. Do you read any poems, short stories, novels, or plays that's not part of your work or your school assignment in the last 12 months? And they also note that they did that survey not only in 2002, but 1992 and 1982. So it's something they do every 10 years. The U.S. Census Bureau does it, and the U.S. Census Bureau you've heard of them. They're busy right now, or they want to be busy right now, but the pandemic is slowing them down. Every 10 years, the U.S. Census Bureau takes a census, a count of all the Americans, all the people that live in America, um, and um, they're a professional, highly capable group, and so every 10 years they're busy doing the census, but then in other years they do other survey work for governments for the government, and this is something they do every 10 years. Is this reading survey, this literary reading survey? Um, so um, if you look at the first word of the title um, and the first word of the news, the press release itself, it says literary, right? Literary reading in dramatic decline. Literary reading. So that's important to keep in mind. Um, um, it's not all reading. It's just that kind of reading. Keep that in mind when you read Andrew Solomon's essay. The opening two paragraphs of the press release um, are background. They kind of give you the big picture view of the situation. Again, the rhetorical situation. It says literary reading is declining among people in every category, every age category, gender, race, socioeconomic class, meaning money and um, career and so forth. So literary reading is declining from 10 years ago, 1992, and 10 years before that in 1982. Paragraph number 3, um, it quotes um, what is he, the chairman of the NEA, Dana Gioia is his name, and it says this report documents a national crisis, reflects a general collapse in advanced literacy. So this is the chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts, of course, is going to be in support of reading and in support of the arts. So for him, he's interpreting this as very bad news, right? So this is a press release, and it's reporting facts about what the survey found, but then of course you have to understand that they are also trying to influence what people think. When you use words like crisis and collapse, then you're clearly intending to um, alarm people and make them motivated to potentially address a problem. So it goes into a discussion here of, men, women, children, blacks, whites, Hispanics, professionals, people without a college degree, etc. And it also talks about how the survey asked people who not only whether they read literature, but also do they do volunteer work, do they play sports, do they go to concerts and sporting events and things like that. And they found that there was a correlation between those things. Um, correlation. If two things are correlated, what does that mean? Correlation. You can see it's almost like the word co-relation, two things that are related to each other. Correlation just means two things go together, right? We talked earlier in the semester about things being associated when we were looking at advertising. If you show the Nike swoosh often enough in a Nike commercial, um, and with the Nike slogan, just do it, then, people learn to correlate the two, right? When they see the Nike swoosh, they think, just do it. Things are correlated when they, appear together, but that doesn't, it's not the same thing as cause and effect. Right? Cause and effect is something else. You remember the discussion about Dr. Pavlov's dogs that would salivate when they heard the bell. The bell and the meat are correlated, right? The meat shows up after the bell rings, but the bell isn't really causing the meat to appear. They're correlated, right? More about that later. Not surprisingly, the level of education affects the reading rates. The more education you have, the more likely you are to read literature. But still, in every group, um, they're reading less than they used to 10 years and 20 years ago. Family income also is correlated with reading literature, with the rate of reading literature. The more money you make, the more likely you are to read literature. Again, that doesn't mean that earning money causes you to read literature. Um, it's probably, remember my little formula that when somebody is claiming that X causes Y, well, it might be that Y causes X, or that there's some Z factor that causes both of them. In this case, it's kind of all of that. If you're good at reading, it's a lot more likely you'll go on to get an advanced degree and then you'll earn more money. If you go on and get an advanced degree, you probably get more training in reading and then you like reading more. So X and Y influence each other. And, it could also be that, being born into a family with parents who have college degrees, that could cause you to get good at reading early on and also to send you to a higher level of education. All right. The survey also reports that more people are actually doing creative writing, or I should say creative writing. Fewer people are reading literature than before, but more people are writing literature. So writing poems and stories and so forth. All right, so that's the background. And the fourth thing in my notes here. Yes, okay, it's on the blue board here. Unfamiliar vocabulary. We're going to, look at specific vocabulary words and clarify that. We've talked about the rhetorical context. This was an article that was published in response to the news that the National Endowment for the Arts released this survey that showed that people are reading less literature. So that was the rhetorical context. And Andrew Solomon says, this is terrible. Fewer people are reading. This is terrible. Unfamiliar genre we talked about, and background knowledge. We're going to go through each of these, and each of these specifically, or more specifically, the essay that you're going to write your critique on. And the background knowledge we'll have to deal with kind of paragraph by paragraph, sentence by sentence when we come across things that maybe are unfamiliar to you. Let's see. Anything else I want to tell you? Oh, the survey also asked about television viewing, and they discovered that higher rates of literature reading go along with lower rates. They're correlated with lower rates of watching television, and vice versa. The more television you watch, typically the less literature you read. Um, why would they think to ask that? Well, if this were, if we were in the classroom, which I wish we were, we could talk about it. It's an obvious sort of connection to make. Um, People like stories, and reading is often a way for people to get stories, right? And television gives us stories the same way that books give us stories. Television gives us information the same way that books give us information. And so, especially if you're talking about reading literature, so often that just means reading a novel or stories. Um, People watch television to get their story fix. You know, people like stories, so it makes sense that um, people either are leaning towards one or the other. If they read more, they probably watch less television because they're devoting their hours, their story hours, to reading, and vice versa. Um, um, so I think there's an implied or potential criticism in that. You know, the idea is that television is. If I asked you this, which is better, reading or television, you'd probably tell me, oh, television is bad for you and reading is good for you, because you know that's what you're supposed to say. But um, what we all do is probably we really enjoy watching things, in some ways more than reading things. Even for people who are readers, reading is more work, right? Um, the video screen is easier to take in because it doesn't require as much decoding. When you see these black marks on a page, you have to process it through that trick we call reading, and it takes mental work. If you're watching pictures and hearing sounds of a story like this, that's what that's what we evolved to be able to do naturally, and it's less effortful. Um, so I think there's a prejudice that would say um, it's bad that Americans are not reading as much because television is bad and rots your mind, and reading is good. There's some truth to that, but um, there's also some important ways in which that's a distortion, as we will see. Okay, so the next um, the next video or videos that I post, I haven't decided whether I'm going to do it in one or two, probably two. You can see from the calendar that one is called Reading with the Grain, and the other is Reading Against the Grain. So if you're familiar, I'm in my basement, so I can show you this, right? This will be great. It doesn't have to be hypothetical. Hold on a second. Here we go. Beautiful piece of wood. Nice piece of pine wood, and you can see that it has grain, right? These lines. Any of you who've ever cut a board, especially if you've done it with the old-fashioned hand saw, you know that cutting this way across the grain is harder than cutting with the grain, because when you cut this way, you're cutting between a lot of the fibers. When you're cutting this way, you're cutting across a lot of the fibers. Same thing is true like when you're cutting meat, right? There's an easy direction to cut it and a harder direction to cut it. Reading with the grain and reading against the grain. This idea is that you can read things. You might remember earlier in the semester I talked about the believing and doubting game. It's a good way to generate ideas, I said, that you have a topic and you, first of all, pretend that you're a person who agrees with what this article says, what an article says, and, well, let me back up. Let's just say it's not an article, but it's just a topic, as I started out saying. You have a topic and you want to, some kind of claim like um, sports develop um, bad character in people. Right? Say, okay, let me see, I'm going to write an article or an essay about that. So let me pretend that I believe that. And I'll generate all the ideas that I can that support that claim that sports create bad character in people. All right, that's the believing game. Now I'm going to set that aside and I'm going to play the doubting game. And I'm going to think of all the reasons why I don't believe in that and what are all the weaknesses of that argument. I generate as many ideas as I can in that direction. Reading with and against the grain are similar. That in that in order to do a critical summary, in order to digest something and critique it, you might want to first of all read through it and see where it is that you agree with the person, you think the person's making a really good point, it's very effective, and you're trying to find as many strengths in the essay as you can. Then you put on a different hat, I guess, and you read against the grain. You resist what the writer is saying, and you try to find flaws and places to disagree. That exercise prepares you well for writing about an essay, because you kind of come at it from both sides, right? So we're going to do that. We're either going to do reading with and against the grain in one video, or probably what I'll do is have one video in which we read with the grain and another in which we read against the grain. All right, 52 minutes and 1 second. Our classes on the Monday, Wednesday, Friday schedule are 52 minutes, so I'm now over time. I'll see you soon.